How's everybody doing? Good. Can you hear me? Yes. This is Cathy Cohen. It's nice hearing your name with that French accent. So let me begin by thanking the organizers of CAR. Thank you for that incredible and detailed and very generous introduction. Thanks, Jean-Paul, for the invitation to speak at really this momentous occasion. I actually want to start by acknowledging the fact that many of us gathered together here are coming here with heavy hearts, still processing and grieving the loss of a great radical scholar, and for many of us, a friend and mentor, Manning Marable. Manning possessed, and many of you know Manning maybe better than I do, but Manning, for me at least, possessed what I would call a radical imagination that allowed him to kind of both live and struggle under present-day systems of oppression, not the least of which is white supremacy, but also never losing sight of the possibility for true liberation and freedom. His work, and by that I mean his writing, his activism, and his life, reflected those tensions and possibilities. For me, Manning was an exemplary model, of course not without contradictions, but steady in his commitment to living a life of struggle even in the academy. He will be dearly missed, but this is, I think, an opportunity for all of us to reflect on our own work and radical imagination. And so it is with Manning in mind and heart that I want to center my talk on how we might understand the non-normative structure of the intimate sphere as a foundation for a radical politic and radical imagination. Paying close attention, however, to the work of a newly or differently racialized state in the U.S. as it continues a neoliberal project of disciplining black desire. I should say that I'm not sure all the pieces of my thinking and imagination, we might say, fit together neatly in this talk. I hope you'll be patient with me. But hopefully it will generate a lively discussion among comrades and colleagues. In many ways, this talk will proceed, and actually, Jean-Paul or someone will tell me when it's time to stop. Right? Okay. I tried to time it, but you never know. This talk will proceed in what I think of as kind of 3 or 4 stages. First, I want to say a few words about neoliberalism as I'm using the term. Second, I want to offer some reflections on the racialization of state power at this particular moment, in particular, of course, with the election and the governing of President Obama, and some of the characteristics of those I'm calling kind of third-wave black politicians. And specifically, I want to talk a bit about why they pose, I think, a different sort of threat to those kind of perceived as engaging in non-normative black desire, with a focus in that part of the talk on kind of marriage and heteronormativity. And finally, I want to conclude by offering a few thoughts about the radical potential of black desire, as I've talked about before, as a way of running a radical black queer politic that both academics and those outside the academy might pursue. So, we'll get started and just see how far we get. So on the topic of neoliberalism, I actually believe that's important for those of us concerned with politics and with black communities to recalibrate our models and analysis of race, sexuality, and the neoliberal project. And what I mean is that I think for some of us, or at least for me, I've been operating with an analysis of neoliberalism that is probably a bit flat and dichotomous, meaning that neoliberalism was and is something done to us and our communities without a complete adoption of a model of the evolving neoliberal project where it is actually something done to us and still at the same time embodied by us. For example, many have commented on and written about the changing political and economic priorities of the country as presidents since Nixon, but in particular Reagan, have adopted a more neoliberal approach to governing. By neoliberalism, I mean a governing agenda that includes the increased privatization of government programs and institutions, like schools and, yes, prisons, the scaling back and in some cases elimination of the welfare state or government assistance to the poor, to those who are low income, and to even the elderly. A move toward fewer economic regulations and more trade free of constraints meant to protect those things that we value, jobs, the environment, and even entities such as unions. I'm sure some of you have been paying attention to Wisconsin, Ohio, and the list will go on. Neoliberalism also involves an intensifying rhetoric that is grounded in the belief that markets, in and of themselves, are better able to produce, in particular, economic outcomes that are fair, presumably sensible, and good for all. Of course, the impact of neoliberalism on the futures of black people, especially my interest, black youth, has meant that many of the resources and beliefs which blacks struggle to win are now being lost, such as the idea that the government should be an active, if not the active player in guaranteeing equality and providing for the basic needs of its citizens. And along with the rise of neoliberalism, there has been a corresponding positioning of multiculturalism and colorblindness as the guiding dominant ideologies for thinking, talking, and acting about race. In many ways, it is a neoliberal multiculturalism that allows the racial order to remain largely intact despite shifting demographics in the U.S. And as we've witnessed this change in the way the governing apparatus approaches its commitments to citizens, current generations of, in particular, poor and working class black people find themselves with fewer options and fewer supports. In the U.S., it is now an understood and lived truth that the loss of much of the manufacturing industry, and with it high pay, or at least decent pay, and low-skilled jobs that once helped to expand the black middle class, has meant now that black youth who are already less likely to finish school or attend college will have greater difficulty landing what we might consider to be a decent paying job through which they can support their family. Further, the privatization of important and public institutions, again like schools, suggests that profit, not societal responsibility or an informed understanding of what constitutes a good education, will strongly influence the decision-making of institutions that are critically important to the well-being and progress of young black people in their communities. Excuse me. Wow. Everybody still okay? Yeah. All right. Quiet. That neoliberal discipline. All right. Now, this reading of the negative impact of neoliberalism on the lives of black people, in particular the black poor and working class, is what we might consider to be the more traditional way that we've measured, modeled, talked about, and written about the consequences of neoliberalism for black Americans. And while a largely structural approach to thinking about neoliberalism in the lives of marginal communities is undoubtedly necessary, it can be incredibly narrow and constraining. When we only look to structural indicators of neoliberalism's impact, especially those most visible in the public sphere, we miss, in fact, many things, especially for the purpose of this talk today. We miss the significant and consequential power of neoliberalism to move fundamental questions and claims around race, class, gender, and sex into the private or intimate sphere, where they are more easily relegated under the pretense of defending upon a defense of agreed upon normative liberal values around family and sex. David Ng writes in his book on queer liberalism that, quote, reacting against identity politics, the culture wars, and to the possibility of a transformative multiculturalism, the Reagan-Thatcher revolution obviated the possibility for national political debates about race, sex, and class by displacing them into the intimate public sphere of privatized citizenship, normative family, and heterosexist morality, end quote. I would also point out that it is and has been kind of the deemed non-normative choices and practices of black people in the intimate public sphere, or the intimate private sphere, which has proven to be an enduring trope and successful strategy for the continued marginalization of black Americans. Thus, I'm interested in the evolving form of the neoliberal project as it is experienced in the domains of sex, family, and desire, what we will call the intimate sphere today. But again, my task today is not only to explore kind of the limiting impact of neoliberalism and heterosexism on black sexual desire, but also to make visible the ways that black people, black bodies, black power have come in some cases to be powerful collaborators in a racialized neoliberal project that uses the framework of multiculturalism and colorblindness to depress analyses of racism at the same time that racist and exclusionary strategies for regulating labor and resources are exported in the name of empire building. So I want to say a bit more now about the idea of kind of powerful black collaborators in the neoliberal project. Now, did somebody say, I said, air and dirty laundry now in Paris. That's just shame, isn't it? I tell you. Not going to be able to go back. When we think of the modern state and its formation, we know from numerous scholars that one central role it has inhabited is that of making and maintaining distinctions, narratives of inclusion and exclusion, and managing the evolution of an expanding political community full of gradations of belonging, gradations of citizenship. Ironically, or maybe not so, modern states have been faced with what they consider to be the crisis of heterogeneity in their populations, in part because of the exploitation, colonization, and invasion practiced at different periods in their histories. The crisis of heterogeneity, in particular a racialized visible heterogeneity or otherness, has resulted in a crisis, for example, over immigration in many countries, including the U.S. Now, David Theo Goldberg argues that, quote, race is integral to the emergence, development, and transformations of the modern state. Race marks and orders the modern nation state. The apparatuses and the technologies employed by various modern states have served to fashion, modify, and reify the terms of racial expression, as well as racial exclusions, as well as subjugations. This is an argument that has been echoed by numerous scholars, not the least of which is Omiya Monat. Goldberg goes on to say that, quote, the figure of the racial state, and of particular the racist state, was fashioned in part by the resistant response of those it most directly and viscerally affected, namely the racially characterized, marginalized, exploited, and excluded, end quote. It is really this comes last quote from Goldberg about the critical role of marginalized, racialized people to the work of making visible, challenging, and destroying the racialized state and its attendant politics that would harm those same communities that seems critical to take note of at this particular moment. I think we must ask, how does the work of making visible the racialized state by academics, those of us in the room, and racialized communities themselves change when the most visible head of the neoliberal project is another person of color? Goldberg suggested, oh, look at that. Okay, a little church up in this family. I'm so jet-lagged, it's sad. Okay. Goldberg suggests that in past, the neoliberal project imposed a clear dichotomy between the state, presumably white and male in its leadership, and the resisting population of those most affected, people of color, and for my instance, in my work, black people. Scholars of the African American experience have similarly represented the primary work of exclusion and inclusion as directed largely by others, those located outside of our community, even while people who looked like us were given the responsibility to manage up close processes of racialization, othering, and the unequal distribution of resources. But with the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States, we now face, I think, a different scenario with regard to state power. Specifically, the state is now racialized not only in terms of its politics of inclusion and exclusion as they are directed toward largely marginal populations within the populace, but also it's racialized in terms of its politics of representation. We now must account for state power against black communities throughout the world, where the head of state and many members of his administration are other black people. Now, some scholars might suggest that this does nothing or should do nothing to our theories of power and oppression. They might say power is power is power. I want to suggest that I think it actually should complicate our understanding of state power and its work in and on black communities. Now, let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that the election of President Obama is the first time state or formal political power has been wielded by a black person. As I've noted in other work, black people both historically, and let me say, and historians have made this point for very long time, and I take my hat off to them. That historically, during Reconstruction and more recently throughout the 20th century, we know that blacks have been elected as state legislators, congressional members, mayors, and other political officials. And while black people have often taken great pride and waged and struggled to win such representation, they also have too often been disappointed in the final hour, as some black politicians have enacted re-election strategies that demobilize poor blacks while underdeveloping black communities. I want to suggest instead, as others have also done, that the election of Barack Obama actually really represents a critical moment in the racialization of the state, in particular in the racialization of dominant state power. There are a number of political scientists, myself included, who have written about the changing nature, commitments, and relationship to formal state power of black politicians today, compared to earlier generations of black politicians and black politics. President Obama and those I will label for this talk third-wave politicians, no relationship to third-wave feminism, are different from the black leaders who ran for congressional offices and local positions of power just after the civil rights movement. Those politicians that are called first-wave black politicians understood their primary constituency to be other black people, and also understood and believed that statewide and national elected positions were really outside the realm of their attainment. Okay. This new generation of elected black officials not only face a different political landscape than first-wave black politicians, they have also built their political machines, we might say, according to different assumptions. For example, no longer is legitimizing constituency through black officials only the black community. In the case of Obama and other similarly positioned black elected officials, like, for example, Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts, the legitimizing constituency is white voters, often young white voters and or affluent white voters. We all remember that it was actually white voters in Iowa who first, we might say, vouched for Barack Obama. The point is that these third-wave candidates are not exclusively, and some might argue primarily, beholden to black communities like most black candidates in the past. They have galvanized cross-racial segments of the population, like young people, building a coalitional infrastructure rarely witnessed before in the electoral arena for black candidates. Now, given that third-wave candidates have built a significant segment of their electing constituency among white voters, and that generally they are running against white candidates, they often find themselves employing a strategy around race that I believe have two central components. First, many third-wave elected black officials find themselves in the tenuous position of running against race, with the mere mention of it being construed as divisive and limiting. We are told that President Obama was not running to be a black president, but instead a president who happens to be a black man. I contend that it is actually their comfort with and closeness to whiteness, without a danger of being read as wanting to be white, that allows politicians like Obama, Patrick, Cory Booker, and other third wavers to decenter race as an explicit mobilizing factor in building their support. In most of the cases of third wavers, they have a comfort with whiteness that is reassuring to whites, but not too threatening to blacks. Tight line. Benjamin Wallace Wells, in a Washington Monthly article, writes that for those I'm calling third wavers, quote, race has been an advantage because whites see in them confirmation that America finally is working, end quote. They represent a multicultural success story, proof that if we leave race out of it, namely colorblindness, the right person will win without ever explicitly discussing their race or race as it operates in the country. It is the perceived transcendence of race on the part of third wavers, an ability honed through institutions like white elite universities and private schools, as well as through their own family structures, that signals to whites that, quote, they fully share in the cultures and values of mainstream white America, end quote, and can be counted on to enforce and defend those values if elected. An interesting dilemma for third wavers in choosing to run against race is actually what to do with the historic nature of some of their races, like the first black president. I believe that what these candidates do is reinterpret the historic nature of their race not as being a beginning or a first, but instead a marker of the end of racial divisions. What these candidates promise is that if citizens unite to elect the first black, you can fill in the blank, they will be writing a new, possibly final chapter in the white supremacist history of this country, allowing all of us to move beyond racially divisive narratives of the nation and its corresponding obligations. A second component of the racial strategy of third wavers is to use their racial insider status, or the racial status of their authenticators. In Obama's case, we might suggest that this is Michelle Obama. Okay. To provide them with a platform to both solidify their support among explicitly racialized constituencies. That word will work right there. Oh, thank you. While outwardly engaging in a bit of racial bullying of the black poor, or as it's more gently described, providing a little public love, tough love, and truth-telling to their own people. My concern with such discussions of personal responsibility, especially as they focus on the intimate sphere, and which I will discuss in greater detail later in the talk, is that most of the discussions of race among third wavers are actually built on the public scolding of, in particular, poor black people, who are represented as not holding up their end of the bargain for acceptance and respectability. What for Bill Clinton we called his sister soldier moment is now the Bill Cosby moment for this new generation of black leaders. Again, my argument or observation is not that black leaders should be silent or silenced on the topic of the presumed personal failures or limitations of black people. My concern, in fact, is twofold. One, that these moments of racial truth-telling become the predominant way in which race, or specifically black communities, are brought into the political discussion of the nation. And two, that counter-arguments about the radical interpretations of the choices of black people in poverty are crowded out in black authorities like President Obama, those who are deemed to have made it the right way, those who are thought to be safe and trustworthy, those who are said to prove that racism is no longer the systemic problem it was when, let's say, Jeremiah Wright was growing up. When these new racial role models speak definitively on the pathologies of poor people, in particular poor black people, the argument about how best to address the issues confronting poor people and poor black Americans is already shut down. In many ways, Obama and the new generation of elected black officials strive to be traditional Democrats. Yet even they are continuously raised as questions about their authenticity and commitment to neoliberal principles and policies are constantly articulated. They are race leaders, they are not race leaders, but race leaders, often a title imposed and not embraced. In terms of the policies they support, third wavers are traditional leftist Democrats, the policy platform that would be found from, I would argue, most left-of-center Democrats running for office. However, I think they seek to distinguish themselves as uniters, and thus their rhetoric is one of political ideological independence. And since political independence is not fully represented in the policies of third wavers, it often actually shows up in their discussions of the role of government and their willingness to expand the role of personal responsibility in the governing system they prescribe. Of course, the expectation of self-reliance and personal responsibility among the upper and middle class is less of an imposing directive when personal responsibility can be bought and supported through nannies, private schools, dinner at restaurants, tutors, and greater access to leisure time and disposable income. It is the poor, usually the black poor, who carry the burden and are the targets of third-wave personal responsibility lectures. It was actually on the campaign trail that this became clear to me when then-candidate Obama praised President Clinton for his restructuring of the Democratic Party to the right, and for highlighting the role of personal responsibility in social change, reminding us all that government cannot and should not try to solve all of our problems. David Axelrod, Obama's campaign manager, has discussed what he believes to be the ideological independence among the third wavers, describing Obama as someone who is not wed to any ideological frame or dogma. He is, quote-unquote, an agent for change. I'll just say a few more things about third wavers, and we're going to get back to the intimate sphere. Since third wavers are actually not wedded to a specific ideological perspective, they are, in fact, allowed to dream big. Their focus is not just on representing black people, or even the left, or any one or two groups. They are engaged in a process of rebirthing the nation, reimagining America, making claims on leadership for the country, and in Obama's case, the world. Wallace Wells notes that, quote, an underlying message of the Obama campaign is that African American candidates can symbolically represent the future, end quote. Maybe as a symbolic precursor to the demographic changes already underway in the country, third wavers are poised to provide leadership for the newly emerging multicultural colorblind nation. But the question still remains, what does the emergence of this group of third wavers, and in particular the election of President Obama, mean for black people? And in terms of our topic today, the state of black desire. As third wavers kind of rebirth the nation, we might ask who stands at its core. And how does having a black president work to deconstruct or reconstruct the state, especially in the intimate sphere? So in the final stage of the talk, which will kind of be the final stage, I want to talk briefly about the use of racialized state power, in this case, in this example, embodied by President Obama, to invigorate and legitimize a conservative or traditional imagining of the intimate sphere that perpetuates, as Ames discussed, the kind of relegation of discrimination to those dimensions of politics construed as private. This, at least, has been kind of my reading, for example, of President Obama's handling of the same-sex marriage issue. Now, let me be clear and fair. President Obama has stated repeatedly that as a public official, he feels it is his duty to ensure that gay and lesbian couples have equal access to the same rights and benefits that married heterosexual couples have. That is short of the right to marry. Repeatedly, the president has voiced his support for a public rights-based equality for LGBT relationships, while holding on to a stance that marriage as a public institution should be reserved only for the union between a man and a woman. He has said that it is his Christian faith that dictates this stance. According to his Bible, marriage is only between a man and a woman. But I want to be clear that it is not really his opposition to same-sex marriage, I share that position for different reasons, that I'm particularly concerned with here. It is instead his use of the intimate realm to discriminate, and then to represent that exclusion as the personal choice of an individual, merely a private act with no public consequences, and somehow unrelated to the systemic deployment of heterosexism that has been used to demonize not only gay and lesbian subjects, but all those, including many black people, who have arranged their intimate lives in ways that are outside of the heterosexual nuclear family structure. Furthermore, what is even, I dare say, more dangerous, I'm sure it's dangerous, about President Obama's commitment to what I would call a conservative framework for the intimate sphere is how effective he is as the representative of such a position. Bolstered by his own blackness and his personal experience as being raised by, at least at times, a single mother, thus deeming him an authoritative figure on family dysfunction in the intimate sphere and the path of recovery from it. It is, in fact, his kind of reasonable tone, his beautiful family, his quiet, dignified, and accessible presentation of the heteronormative ideal, absent any mocking or denigrating of gay people, that marks, I believe, the effectiveness of President Obama's kind of proselytizing. he is, in fact, more likely to hold up and take to task different segments of black people for their perceived normative failures in the intimate sphere, black fathers, black parents, black youth, than he is to hold LGBT folks accountable. President Obama has shifted the tone, but I would argue not the message of the primacy of a nuclear normative family structure. And in doing so, he has monopolized, I believe, the discursive space in and about black communities and in and about black intimacy. And while historically the normal heterosexual family, was racialized as white, in the age of Obama, black heteronormativity is making a comeback. We are witnessing a moment where heterosexual black love, instead of black family dysfunction, is taking center stage. And I dare say casting a dark shadow on the majority of black Americans who have not lived up to the heteronormative ideal. It has been suggested that President Obama's most powerful support of the heteronormative nuclear family may be in a realm that he does not totally control, namely the media coverage of his family. In a 2009 Chicago Tribune article entitled "Reality Carefully Scripted, First Family Imagery, Part of the Strategic Plan," the reporters write that, quote, "Like a reality show set on a glorified soundstage at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the details of one family's life have captivated the country, if not the world, making the Obama seem within reach, an ordinary family that just happens to be living an extraordinary existence." They go on to argue that, quote, "These glimpses into President Barack Obama's household are far from spontaneous. Instead, they are part of a careful strategy that has helped bolster the new president's popularity and political clout. Since November, American magazine readers have seen a steady stream of coverage lionizing the Obamas and their marriage, with access parceled out to Vogue, People, Essence, and Oprah Winfrey's magazine. Embracing celebrity news outlets is nothing new for presidents or political figures eager to relate to average Americans, but White House aides and celebrity news executives say the Obamas are taking the engagement to a new level. I wanted to show you a few of those slides. I'm trying to move to the next slide. Well, I can do it. No, it's okay. I'll just take it from very quick. Okay. They are a beautiful family, I'm proud to say. One from Chicago, so that's not. Here's the issue. In contrast, actually, to the kind of heteronormative model that the Obamas personify in the lived experience is the lived experience of most black people. The truth of the structure of the black intimate sphere, at least in the U.S., is that nearly 80% of black children are born, at least 80% of black children born to women under 30 were to women who actually were not married. Data indicates that the majority of black children do not live in two-parent homes. And the majority of black children born between 1960 and 2009 were born to mothers who were not married. Right? Hold on. So that's... Okay. These are the details of black intimate sphere. Details that make black people vulnerable to state power, that would regulate them not by legal disenfranchisement based on race, but instead that would minimize their status as full citizens by highlighting their incompatibility with normative expectations around family, sex, and desire, the structure of the intimate sphere. Now, numerous scholars have written about the racialized nature and history of state policies regulating what are thought to be deviant or non-normative families. Marriage, of course, falls into the category of a racialized state project that is involved in the differential distribution of rights and that disproportionately disadvantages Black people. By embracing a restrictive notion of marriage, or actually I might argue any system of marriage, I know he's going to support marriage, President Obama participates in and endorses the continued use of marriage to not only unequally distribute benefits and resources, but also as a mechanism of power and status in the hierarchy of citizenship that undergirds the racial order. Marriage, especially as it's tied to reproduction and the reproduction of the citizenry, begins at birth to sort the nation into different groups, with aggressive regulatory policies targeting, demonizing, and regulating single-parent families, especially poor and Black families, as well as gay, lesbian, and transgender folk. Moreover, as the commitment to heteronormativity is pursued in Black communities through Black institutions, it blatantly rejects critical aspects of Black diversity and curtails, I would argue, the life options of Black Americans. Many, if not most, Black institutions have become so defined by heterosexist rhetoric, images, and values that their vision of Black empowerment are inextricably linked to Black men, Black patriarchy, and the preservation of some mythic Black nuclear family. Examples of this hysteria include a number of campaigns that I've recently come across, and I'm sure you have too. The No Wedding, No Womb campaign, where we are insisting that if Black women don't get married, they're not allowed to have children or to have sex. The Marry Your Baby Daddy Day that was started. The Black Marriage Day, and a campaign that is ongoing right now to equate the reproductive rights of Black women and the decisions around abortion with genocide in the Black community. I'll show you one of their. Now, this may be a bit of a stretch, and I'm sure we'll be told so later, but by signaling that it's okay to discriminate against individuals in the private sphere based on their intimate choices and behaviors and the dictates of your reading of your Bible, I believe it actually harms President Obama's ability to target a country like Uganda when officials in that country call for the legitimized killing of gays and lesbians based on their understanding of the intimate choices of individuals as interpreted through an imported, Americanized evangelical Christian commitment to heteronormativity. I want to be clear, because I know somebody's going to talk about me later. This is not an anti-Obama talk. It's really a talk, I'm hoping, meant to help us think through the question of how do we interrogate the increasing racialization of state power and its impact on the lives of Black people. It's my contention that as scholars of African American studies with a deep commitment to Black people, we have at times been less than diligent in our work when we attempt to explain or account for the non-normative choices of Black people in the intimate realm. We have not always troubled the assumptions of normality that define us as other. And we have too often been silent about the reach and the work of this new racialized state power, conflicted by our loyalty to and pride in Obama, and the recognition that the state now has a powerful grip on Black communities. We are told to be more patient with President Obama, to have his back against those on the right who would contest his citizenship, his religion, and even his humanity. However, I want to suggest today that those of us who take seriously Manning Marable's statement that, quote, those of us fortunate enough to gain access should recognize that the monopoly of power that severely restricts the mobility of our own communities is still in place. Those of us who still hold true Audre Lorde's declaration that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Those of us who remember Joseph Bean declaring that black men loving black men is a revolutionary act and not a non-normative failure. If we take seriously their work, their lives, then we must challenge not Barack Obama per se, but any deployment of racialized state power that seeks to delimit the choices, the agency, and claims for equality by black people by relegating such demands to the intimate sphere where such demands are more easily dismissed and pathologized. So you might ask, appropriately, okay, Cathy, what do we do to challenge the attack on black people through the intimate sphere? Maybe you would ask that question. Well, first, as an immediate action, I would say that we have to develop policies that will support the success of black intimate reality without trying to transform these families, these relationships, into dominant models of nuclear heterosexual families that ineffectively guides our current policy and black discourse and action in black communities. But I want to suggest that we do more than that. I want to suggest again, because I've said it before, that we embrace the non-normative intimate choices of many black people, not for their adaptive functionality, but for the possibility of the base of an oppositional politics. I've argued this before, so I will make it brief. I'm interested in how deviant choices that are represented by groups or subgroups of people can create a public and discursive space in which normative myths of how society is naturally structured can be challenged. In this deviant space, I contend is the possibility of transformative and radical change, not only in the distribution of resources and power, but in the narrative of normality that structures the society and the behavior of most people. Understanding the oppositional potential invested in this space is, I believe, essential to the progress of black people, if for no other reason than the fact that the majority of black people in the United States will never meet some mythic heteronormative ideal. Given this reality, it seems to me to dictate the need for a politics built around a radical imagination, one that includes and possibly centers those black people who are clearly familiar with the normative expectations of both black communities and white dominant society, yet still with that knowledge choose acts and identities that place them outside of both imposed and indigenous norms of respectable or acceptable behavior. It is, I believe, the work of researchers like ourselves to investigate, explore, and be prepared to promote the transformative potential of what I have previously called a politics of deviance, recognizing the agency of those labeled other in the intimate realm, and then using the discursive space created to transform individual acts of autonomy into an oppositional politics. It is the agency of people who, understanding the expectations of the larger society and their communities, choose differently from what is prescribed. In some cases, putting their community standing, if not their lives, in jeopardy, that I believe must be the point from which we start to build a future politics for black people and a future research agenda for African American studies. Again, I have suggested previously that in terms of the academy, this for me is what some of us have been calling the queering of black studies, the kind of work detailed in the canonical volume edited by Mae Henderson and E. Patrick Johnson, Black Queer Studies. I'm talking about a theoretical framework built on the work, in particular, of black feminists and some queer theorists, where the different normative behavior and marginal position of segments of black communities is highlighted, not with an eye toward pathologizing or even justifying such behavior, but with an eye toward recognizing and building from its subversive political potential. I would urge all of us to use a feminist lens to interrogate the exertion of relative power, often by those most vulnerable and marginalized and already oppressed groups. These deviant choices, which are by no means chosen completely freely in the liberal sense, have the ability to tell us a great deal, I think, about how agency is pursued, not with the objective, at least initially, of being oppositional, but instead to secure other rewards such as pleasure and desire. So in conclusion, while I believe the intimate sphere to be a critical area for understanding the work of neoliberalism and racialized state power, I also believe the intimate sphere, as seen in the lives of Black people, actually can provide the basis for a radical understanding of intimacy, family, and sex in Black communities, and probably all communities. As I see it, as Jean-Paul stated yesterday, those of us concerned with the progress and study of Black people are confronted with a choice about where we will align ourselves politically. In the midst of a time of revolution, we must ask with whom we will stand and where we will act. The future, even under the Obama administration, promises some mobility for those who can conform to a strict politics of respectability that demands adherence to normative ideas of marriage, family, and the state. For many of us, full recognition and respectability, even within Black communities, is not an option. We face a political future where embracing deviance may be our biggest gamble, but our only chance for a full life. Thus, we can adhere to the neoliberal project, with some in Black communities gaining access and pseudo-power, but leaving many in our families behind. Alternatively, we can choose a politics of deviance where we will struggle to build new norms and ways of relating, first in the intimate realm and later in the public and political sphere. For me, the politics of deviance holds the potential for transformation, not only transformation of the material conditions of Black people's lives, but also of the norms that define us as other and legitimize the assaults leveled against us daily. It also holds, I believe, in fact, a possibility, at least for me, for making the Academy and African American Studies in particular politically engaging and relevant in the tradition of Audre Lorde and Manning Marable. Thank you very much.
Students often ask us in France about why are so many Black intellectuals opposed to affirmative action?
Opposed?
Yes, well, this is a question that comes, and many African students tell us, well, we are opposed to affirmative action. I tell them, well, you're not Emmett Till and you were not in Mississippi in 1955, maybe that's why. But what is your position on the dismantling of affirmative action?
Okay, that's dangerous, you know? Okay, well, my position on affirmative action. Yes, I support affirmative action. I want to say a little bit more because I think there is a discussion about what we want, right? And some of the difficulties that we've found in affirmative action about which groups have access to elite institutions through affirmative action, and how, in fact, the depth of the impact or the intervention in Black communities is not, in fact, what we would necessarily like to see. But I think if the idea behind affirmative action is, in fact, to provide some Black people with access to education that they wouldn't previously have, I think that's right. But we clearly have to do more. But there's also, for me, the question of how does one transform these institutions, these universities and colleges, and clearly I think what we've learned over the last 30 years, it's not necessarily through affirmative action, right? That the universities, my colleague Ken Lawrence, I'll be careful what I say, that universities are very good at appropriating sites of resistance, or at least sites that were initially resistant, right? So we have seen kind of the professionalization and indoctrination of African American studies programs throughout universities. That now, I would say, discipline Black scholars better than traditional disciplines do, right? As a kind of way to perform their ability to be recognized. And I want to say, I'm not suggesting that's not something people have to do, but I do think there's a question about what is the nature of our position in academies and what is the work that we're there to do. And at some level, I know it is about transformation, and I know that, in fact, we haven't done that work. We've done some of that work with curriculum. We've made people in communities that were previously invisible present. But the kind of fundamental shift in power, I'm not sure we've seen. We've seen more of us, I'm the deputy provost, have positions of power in universities, but oftentimes we end up representing those institutions perpetuating kind of the same systems of merit and which are presumed to be merit. So all that to say, while I support affirmative action, it seems to me that if there's a different type of transformative project that we're involved in terms of access to education and changing universities and colleges, that's not going to happen just through affirmative action.
Hi, Lance McCready, University of Toronto. I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between sort of the politics of respectability and economic growth within Black communities and the growth of institutions, because I work in the field of education and a number of educational leaders feel that they need to express politics of respectability and kind of police the intimate sphere, because that will give them more access to resources to, for instance, build schools, or not build schools, or bring more resources to schools for various, things like after-school programs, curriculum, etc. And I'm wondering if, one example would be sort of Jeffrey Canada's sort of work in the Harlem Children's Zone. But I'm wondering if we have developed economic models to really say that there's I don't know if I'm saying this right, but like there can be capital growth in a politics of deviance. So a number of them feel like if the goal is to sort of build capital or build resources in communities, can you do that and at the same time sort of be acting or expressing a politics of deviance?
Okay, so I get, okay, so I understand the concern about the need to take care of kind of very pressing issues like economic opportunity and the growth of opportunity in Black communities. What I'm always interested in is the need to discipline Black bodies and Black workers in ways that don't at all relate to the economic work, the job, right? That in fact they're engaged in. So in the educational sphere, there's been this huge move towards uniforms, right? And there's one argument that says, there are a couple different arguments. One is you take away the ability for young Black people to compete with each other and de-escalate the possibility of violence by just making them all look the same clothes. It seems to me that an important part of what you learn in an educational system is, one, the ability to express oneself and define a level of expertise and expression that is significant for you, and sometimes that's aesthetically through the clothes that you wear. The other thing it seems that we have to teach is to figure out how people negotiate the idea of difference and wanting, and even how do you deal with kind of the consumer pressures of consumption pressures of living in a consumer society, right? So there's a way in which it seems to me that the work of educational systems, we preclude that by saying we're going to put all Black kids in a uniform, right? So it is, I'm trying to get to this answer, which is, one of the arguments I hear often about is young Black people don't know how to present themselves when they're coming to work, right? The thing I hear all the time is, do you believe his pants were sagging? His pants were so low that, okay, what?
Your question was?
I missed the question?
I don't know, but I understood him as asking that if you decide to support that kind of politics, you're in limbo because you get less money to support your projects.
Right. So, Okay, so you're saying, how does one, in a practical sense, adapt this, right? So I think there are a couple different ways. One is, remember, I'm not saying we should all go out and practice a politics of deviance today in Paris, and that's the end of that, right? That there are practical considerations. But you know, the other thing is, let's be clear that people make decisions about what will fulfill their life that puts money in jeopardy all the time, right? That there are expectations, for example, with a welfare state, that black women will do certain things or women will do certain things, including kind of naming a father, that they reject, right? I mean, this is part of the fundamental understanding of deviance, that it is not only a purely economic equation for when people make decisions about doing something that doesn't look rational to us. And I think the politics of deviance calls on us to understand what allows someone to look irrational in the pursuit of happiness, of pleasure, of sex, of relationships, of intimacy, and how then do you build a movement about that irrationality that is kind of fueled by a commitment to certain things that we generally don't value because we will say, you're going to lose money by doing that, right? It could be kind of an understanding of the relative deprivation of I don't have that much money anyway. So the little bit you're going to give me for conforming is not worth it. I'd rather have the label and the practice of deviance and have a different form of pleasure other than the economic kind of result that you're going to have.
Thanks for that answer.
No.
That was not the question I wanted to ask. So thanks for your talk first. And my question goes to your very last sentence because I was entirely intrigued by your connecting Marable and Audre Lorde, which are not in my memory of things over the last 20 years, would not be the most likely candidates to be united in a sentence that talks about sort of utopian politics of deviance. And I was, I'm trying to hear you, like, what are the things that connect them? Like, why do you pick these two people?
Well, I mean, can I ask you a question? So can I ask you, why would you not put those two together?
No, I'm just, I mean, I probably, but I'm just curious.
No, I am too. So, I mean, I'm really interested in why you would not put them together. I mean, seriously.
Okay, now, Manning Marable for me, and maybe I'm totally, off track here, stands for radical, structural, post-Marxist critique of the system. And Audre Lorde stands for me, if I may say one thing, for the power of the erotic. And there are sort of classical historical narratives in which these two things have been pitted very much against each other. And I find that a wonderful idea to conjoin them,
right.
Which was why I'm so intrigued.
Okay, so in response, I totally get that. One, I think, in fact, I would put those two components as part of a kind of radical deviant understanding. That a radical deviant understanding has to be about kind of intimate, sexual, erotic, but it also can't be oblivious to kind of the structural conditions that, in fact, people make decisions and exert agency. But I think I put them together also because of my personal experience with Manning. Because independent of his kind of political positions, I have been in political rooms where Manning is, in fact, the black man who stands up and supports the black feminist and the black feminist lesbian that I am, right? And so it is that connection for me that kind of positions me as saying, when I think about the world and the politics of African American studies that I'd like to see out there, as a social scientist, I want someone with a radical analysis that also understands the significance of people having, of the diversity of black communities. And to me, that's Manning. And then, of course, as a black feminist, as a black lesbian, I have to always pay homage, relate to speak the name of Audre Lorde, and I would not, that's why I also would mention Joseph Beam. I mean, we could go down the list of people that I would tie together in this kind of intersectional history of saying you're allowed to be in the academy, but your responsibility is also to change it.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. We have about a little bit less than 5 minutes, hardly 5 minutes at all. So 2 more questions.
All right. Hello. Thank you, Cathy Cohen. I'm over here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, I was like, hi.
Yes. My name is Janelle Hobson. I'm at the University at Albany. And I have a question. Actually, one is a comment and the other is a question. The first comment is I'm fascinated by this this new image from the that'sabortion.com. Every 21 minutes, our next possible leader is aborted. They're the ones who did that infamous, the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb.
Has everyone seen that?
Yes. So, of course, I'm kind of curious because it seems that they are still, well, one, it's the racialization of Obama, because I don't know if they remember that his mother is white. So, well, I'm just going to put that out there because obviously they were targeting black women's bodies when they were doing these kind of negative, you know, anti-abortion slogans. So, but I think it's tied to my question because of this constant racialization of Obama, which I think is related to that kind of politics of respectability, which gets articulated through the whole heteronormative discourse. Because it seems to me historically that we do that. When you think of with emancipation, it's like right after emancipation, all the slaves got married because they needed to kind of like reassert themselves as citizens, and somehow through that whole heteronormative institution, that was how they were going to assert their citizenship. And so this idea of using the family to elect Obama, I think is really fascinating that we keep going back to that. And at the same time, I'm wondering, when we talk about the politics of deviance, if we also have to critically reassess what the politics of respectability is about as well, because the black body, whether it's queer or heterosexual, is deviant. You know, historically it's been read as deviant, and so the very emphasis of black communities to always assert a kind of politics of respectability is always to kind of counter that whole discourse of the deviant black body. And so you see that even with the Obamas in the White House, you have the kind of celebratory imagery of the family, but there's so many ways in which they're always shown as if they're not quite getting it right. I'm especially thinking of Michelle Obama as First Lady and all the ways in which her body's under constant scrutiny. So that discourse of the deviant black body seems to keep reasserting itself despite all the efforts to kind of enter into politics of respectability. I wonder if you could talk about that.
You've done it all. Yes. Can I just say one thing? Which is, what's interesting is, I think they might be different campaigns, but the different ways that Obama is used in this one campaign. So here it is, embrace Obama, and in fact, if you want other Obamas, you better stop abortions. The other, there are a number of other ads which actually take him on as being the perpetrator of genocide in black communities. That in fact, he is the most supportive of abortion of any president there ever has been. That was one of the ads that I saw. And that actually what we have to do as black people to protect ourselves is actually make sure Obama loses. That was another campaign. So there is this kind of way in which he is utilized for all sides of a reproductive battle around the black movement, so to speak.
So we have time for one very, very brief question and one very brief answer.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Amber Johnson at Collegium University. And some of my past scholarship has been in queer studies, and a lot of my newer scholarship is moving in that direction. And I'd like to know if you can address the safe space that I can carve as a married woman with 2 children, but black at the same time, obviously. And I've been accused of being queer, not from a sexual standpoint, but from this idea of generally, what did you say? You said it, right? Generally not valuing those things that are heteronormative but valuing those things that are deviant, that are different. So how do I carve a safer space to study that?
Why do you want to be safe?
Because I don't know, I'm asking, as a married woman, I just have to...
You're safe, honey. I mean, this is the truth, right? If it gets too dangerous, you can deploy, I'm married. Right? I mean,
That's not my honor.
No, what? Go ahead.
How do I create a space that the flack that I might get from those who are not heterosexual,
Right.
not those who are.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, so.
Do I have the authority to say
who's gonna? I want to be. First of all, thank you for your question. So I want to be thoughtful about this and not just react. I completely understand the idea that somehow the space of queer theory has been carved out and is defined as the only authoritative voices in that space can be queer people, black queer people, if we're talking about black queer theory. I just have never experienced that. And now, you could say because you're not heterosexual, but I've never experienced my colleagues who do black queer studies, who do black queer theory, as kind of policing the work, other than to what degree does it contribute to our knowledge in this area. The second thing I guess I would say is, the truth is to be out, to be queer. Now, some of us tenured are great, but to be a young scholar and to actually be queer and be doing queer studies, you have very little power in the academy, right? So, I mean, it is, it's hard, I think, for me to hear that you feel that a group who I would argue have been largely marginalized in the academy, and actually for black people marginalized in the study of queer theory and queer politics, to feel that they have enough power to keep you out of doing that work. I would think we would all embrace you, there you go, and welcome you into the fold with your little queer self.